The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thanks to all of you for coming today. And originally we were going to do, or I had hoped to do this talk tomorrow, but Joe informed me that libraries are closed on Election Day, and that would have been the actual anniversary. Now, Calvin Coolidge, a lot of people say, now, why Calvin Coolidge? Interestingly enough, there's a fellow out now who is coming to Albany in the near future, Richard Norton Smith, with a biography of Nelson Rockefeller. He's a major historian, and the Atlantic Monthly did a survey, it's in this month's issue, as to who is the most underrated politician of all time. And Richard Norton Smith said this: Calvin Coolidge. His flinty charisma, no less than his flinty integrity, proved a welcome alternative to Wilsonian uplift and Harding's Ohio cronyism. He abolished the last vestiges of the wartime Red Scare, slashed taxes, called for Americans to work more for themselves and less for their government, and restored confidence in Washington. Hardly a man for all seasons, but most emphatically one for his time. The 1924 election follows, not surprisingly, on the heels of the 1920 election, when Americans repudiate Woodrow Wilson's very activist, progressive administration, his League of Nations, an economy which is seriously on the fritz, and turn to Warren Gamaliel Harding. Harding is elected in a massive landslide in 1920. Just sweeping the country. His vice president is Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, a native Vermonter, moves to Massachusetts, works his way up the political ladder from city councilman to state rep, state senator, mayor, president of the state senate, lieutenant governor, governor. He holds more elected offices than any president of the United States, and probably more than any American. They had not planned to nominate Coolidge in 1920, but the convention stampedes and makes him the vice presidential candidate. They're elected. Warren Harding dies August 2nd, 1923, of a massive heart attack in San Francisco. I was doing a podcast the other day with a fellow from Washington. He says, so of course, Coolidge is vice president. He's the president. He's going to be renominated again, like Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And the answer to that is wrong, because the times are so very different. And you're going to see this throughout this story today, and most of history, where things we assume are the same now are not the same then. Coolidge, the nominee? Ain't necessarily so. In fact, it's probably not the case. Coolidge, low-key kind of guy, gets to Washington, is ignored. There are rumors he's going to be dumped from the ticket in 1924. I kind of doubt that, because Warren Harding, for all his faults, is a kind of kindly individual. I don't see him trashing his vice president that way. And in fact, he had brought Coolidge into cabinet meetings. Coolidge was the first vice president to attend cabinet meetings. They had been excluded before that, thought to be part of, and technically are, part of the legislative branch of government. But Coolidge sits in on these meetings, so in that sense, he is prepared more than any other vice president to assume the presidency. But will he be nominated? Teddy Roosevelt had been nominated. But Teddy Roosevelt was Teddy Roosevelt. No one was ever like Teddy Roosevelt before or since. So don't take him as the precedent. Take John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, Chester Alan Arthur as the precedent. Accidental presidents are not renominated. Even Harry Truman has difficulty in 1948 getting the nomination, being given the path to the presidency. So is Coolidge going to be renominated? There's other issues, even if he's renominated, as to what's going to happen in 1924. Because the Republicans, riding high in April, shot down in May, riding high in 1920, shot down in 1922. We're on the verge right now of midterm elections. We're expecting something to happen, some sort of big earth-shaking event. The earth shakes in 1922 again. Republicans lose 7 Senate seats, 77 House seats. Democrats think we're coming back. They also think they're coming back because the oil scandals, Teapot Dome, is starting to percolate up, and people are beginning to realize there had been corruption in the Harding administration. There had been problems also in the Justice Department with his Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, a crony of his from Ohio. So between the two events, and also there was a big railroad strike in 1922. Attorney General Daugherty had to issue an injunction, really alienated organized labor. A lot of straws in the wind that the Democrats are coming back. Coolidge is sworn in by his Know the Republic father in Vermont, good photo op. Down home, homespun, man of the people. Steps before Congress, gives a report to the American people in December 1923, says he's against the United Nations, for the World Court, for economy and government, for increasing restrictions on immigration, against a very convoluted plan to aid agriculture, which is going to be known as McNary-Haugen. Takes his stand on a lot of controversial issues, does it in a very plain way, and people go, wow, this guy's got courage, this guy's got something different. He's integrity, straightforward. We think we like him. There are people who were going to challenge him, one of which was a senator from California named Hiram Johnson. He had run with TR in 1916, a progressive. He pretty much gets knocked out real soon. Coolidge puts together his campaign team, including a chief of staff that was then known as secretary to the president, a guy named C. Bascom Slemp, which sounds like a villain from the old melodramas. In point of fact, he's a former Republican congressman from Virginia, which made him one of the 2 Republican congressmen from the entire South. And he knew how conventions worked. He knew how to control the Southern Republican delegates, who represented almost nobody, but whose votes counted at the convention. Coolidge is going to work those votes to get the nomination. They are often black votes. Republicans are still largely, or blacks are still largely Republican at that point, and will be through the 1932 election. Blacks will vote for Hoover in 1932, despite everything. Coolidge does some interesting things leading up to the election, little PR kind of things. He signs and autographs a baseball for a charity auction, first time. There's a delegation of 25 midgets who go to Union Station and are proclaimed to be the Coolidge Marching Band. So there's these little photo ops going out there, and people are intrigued by this guy. By the time the spring comes along, he's got the nomination wrapped up. The little engine that could pretty much has it done at that point. The Democrats still think they have a chance. Their main contender is a pretty solid guy, pretty substantial actually, and his name is William Gibbs McAdoo. Not perhaps well known nowadays, but the historian Paul Johnson says he's one of the great Treasury secretaries. He had been in that post in World War I, basically ran the American economy. When World War I starts, the European powers start taking their money out, or the European investors take their money out of the stock market and threaten to crash it. McAdoo essentially closes the stock market for a month. Somewhat unauthorized, but he manages to do it and stabilize the American economy and the stock market and the investment system. He is Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law. He got the job as Treasury Secretary before he married the boss's daughter. He had wanted the nomination in 1920, doesn't get it. In 1920, he's raring to go, though. But these oil scandals, which were tarnishing the Republicans, when the congressional hearings are going on, all of a sudden one of the crooked oil men, a fellow named Doheny, blurts out that he had had William Gibbs McAdoo on his payroll as well for big, big bucks. McAdoo has nothing to do with the scandals in the Harding administration, but Doheny's money sticks to him and makes him look suspect. There's another thing which makes him look suspect, and that is the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan had started in 1915 or so, got up and rolling in the 1920s. In the mid-1920s was a big deal. It was a big deal in the Southern Democratic Party, more so in the Republican Party in the North. And the guy that they like most is William Gibbs McAdoo. McAdoo is a progressive. He's not a conservative. He's a progressive. He is a prohibitionist, however. They are for prohibition. And McAdoo's opponent, primary opponent in 1924 for the Democratic nomination is someone well known to New Yorkers, and that is Governor Alfred Emanuel Smith. Smith is a dripping wet. He is opposed to prohibition. He is from the sidewalks of New York, from the Lower East Side. He is a Roman Catholic, and he is not someone that the mass of the people west of the Hudson can really dig. New Yorkers often don't translate well to the rest of the electorate. Franklin Roosevelt breaks that rule, certainly, but Al Smith cannot. And so the people who are the rural progressives in many cases, the heirs to William Jennings Bryan, are backing McAdoo against Smith. They hold the Democratic National Convention in Madison Square Garden. New York put up the most amount of money for Democrats to come to Gotham. There hadn't been a convention in New York for quite a while, and they were going to Madison Square Garden, not the one on 50th Street, not the one on 34th Street, but the one on, oddly enough, Madison Square, which they were about to tear down. It was going to be the last event. And if they weren't going to tear it down anyway, the delegates damn near tore it down on their own. The Democrats had a thing until 1936 called the two-thirds rule. It preserved basically Southern power in the Democratic Party. You had to have a consensus. You couldn't have someone too much this way or that way in the Democratic Party, although you often ended up with someone too much this way or that way, despite that. So McAdoo comes in with a majority of the delegates. He's a popular guy, but not that popular. And there are an awful lot of dark horses, favorite sons, clogging up the procedures. And then there's Al Smith. They battle on and on and on. There's no air conditioning at all. In fact, they think that the vents are all blocked up. It's hotter and hotter. The people from the hinterlands come into New York. They're like afraid of Sin City here. The delegates are packed with Al Smith supporters. It gets pretty ugly. There are the Klan, which had a presence even in New York City at that point, particularly in Queens. There's a mayoral election which is going to come up, and one of the issues is, did Mayor Hyland allow a Klan parade in Queens? But the Klan crosses across the river from New York City and New Jersey to send the message to the Democrats. So, ballot after ballot, it starts off with another one of these favorite sons, with the delegate from Alabama booming out, "Alabama casts 24 votes for Oscar W. Underwood," who wasn't a bad candidate. He was anti-Klan, believe it or not. But this went on for ballot after ballot after ballot, and they say, "You get out." "No, you get out." "You stop." "No, you stop. You started it first." I mean, it's really intelligent. And around the 93rd ballot, William Gibbs McAdoo finally withdraws, because Smith had been saying, "I'll withdraw, but you have to get out." And McAdoo had been the leader throughout the entire process. He only gets within 20 votes at his peak of having a majority, let alone the 2/3 rule. This tells you how fractured the Democrats are. And they are running out of money. They are running out of patience. I mean, when I say they are running out of money, I mean the individual delegates are running out of money to pay their hotel bills. So, 93rd ballot, it goes on and on and on again to the 103rd. 103rd. By the way, one of the candidates who pops up as being a possible compromise before that is a guy named Samuel Ralston. Samuel Ralston is the governor of Indiana. He appears at a couple points to be the logical compromise candidate. He is even more of a Klan candidate than McAdoo. Okay? So it's a crazy situation. 103rd ballot, the Democrats turn to John W. Davis. Who's he? He's a pretty capable guy. He's a smart guy. He had been a 2-term congressman from West Virginia, who then became Woodrow Wilson's Solicitor General. And when he went to appear before the Supreme Court, it was like, what was that E.F. Hutton had where everyone was listening? He was just amazing. It was like, well, whatever Davis says, we'll rule that way, because he's like so smart. He's really good. He is also, by the way, you know, he just, as I say, people's luck runs out after a while. He doesn't win all his Supreme Court cases. He loses one which he argues in 1954. It's called Brown versus Board of Education. Anyway, but he had been our Solicitor General. Wilson appoints him ambassador to the Court of St. James, where he does very well. So he's thought of as a rising star in the Democratic Party, but he has a problem. And it's that sort of same money problem that McAdoo has. When he leaves the administration, he goes and takes a job in a Wall Street firm, and the firm represents J.P. Morgan. If you think that people get upset about the 1%ers or about Wall Street now, and that's something new, it ain't new. They've been mad at it for a very long period of time. And that's one of the things where if you get too close to Wall Street, particularly in the Democratic Party, it can derail your candidacy. It derails a guy named Champ Clark in 1916 and helps Woodrow Wilson get nominated. But the Democrats just just want to get out of town so badly, they overlook this with John W. Davis and nominate him, even though his record is kind of thin. He's a Wall Street guy, and this is going to upset the populists in the party, although he tries to balance the ticket by putting in a guy named Bryan, not William Jennings Bryan, but his younger brother, who is the governor of Nebraska. He's pretty left-wing. So you've got this unbalanced ticket because Davis is very conservative. He's very conservative. This election has been called the high tide of American conservatism because both Coolidge and Davis, between this election and 1954, he's also going to bolt the Democratic Party to oppose Franklin Roosevelt after Roosevelt is elected. He's a big mover and shaker with Alfred E. Smith in something called the Liberty League, which is a bunch of people who had been anti-prohibition Democrats, fairly conservative, who are going to oppose Roosevelt and the New Deal. So that's Davis. The convention had also had something else be a significant moment in it. And somewhere around the 60th or 70th ballot, they get word of events from Washington. President Coolidge had two sons, the younger of which was about 14 years old. They come back from military academy, Mercersburg Military Academy, late June, and they are playing tennis on the White House lawn. The younger son, Calvin Jr., develops a blister on his toe. He's not wearing his socks when he's playing tennis. Gets this blister, it becomes infected. By July 4th, he's seriously, seriously ill. Coolidge is beside himself, and by July 7th, 1924, Calvin Coolidge Jr. is dead. There's no penicillin then. There's no antibiotics. It's sepsis, infection, kills an awful lot of people. That's what killed President Garfield in like 1924. Probably killed McKinley. This takes Coolidge's campaign down several notches. He always believed the job seeks the man. So he was not about to go out and give a lot of talks. And also it was said when he was lieutenant governor of Massachusetts under a guy named Samuel McCall that McCall could fill any hall in Massachusetts as a speaker, and Coolidge could empty it. Coolidge he has this sort of quacking voice and all, but presidents often did not go out and campaign a lot back then. He was probably not going to do a lot of campaigning anyway, but the fact that his son has died and periods of mourning were so pronounced then that he's going to stay home even more through this campaign. The Republicans do resort to a few gimmicks and photo ops which are noteworthy. They have a Plymouth Notch. Coolidge is from Plymouth Notch in Vermont. They have a hometown band, and they send that around the country. They have a 100,000 car Lincoln Highway caravan. There was this Lincoln Highway before the interstate highway system, and they have 100,000 cars. Imagine how many cars there were in the country then. Taking part in this coast-to-coast parade for Coolidge and his running mate, Charles Dawes. And then they have Coolidge goes back up to Plymouth Notch, and the titans of industry, Henry Ford, Charles Alva Edison, Harvey Firestone come up and basically endorse him. And this is significant too. One of the things about Coolidge not getting the nomination, or possibly not getting the nomination in 1924, is there was this guy who might have, from outside the political system. Think of him as sort of a H. Ross Perot of the 20s, and that would have been Henry Ford. Henry Ford had run for the U.S. Senate in 1918 as a Democrat, and more to the point, they took a straw poll of who do you like for president in 1924 before Harding died. And beating Harding, who was still liked personally, was Henry Ford. But as early as December 1923, Ford says, Coolidge is sound. We're going to stick with him. The Democrats go out and about, Davis campaigning. This is the year when we actually see the first sound films of political campaigns. 3 years before the jazz singer, a motion picture pioneer by the name of Lee DeForest, photographs in sound films the three contenders. I said three contenders. I haven't seen the one of John W. Davis, but I have seen a silent film of him, and it kind of tells you what kind of problems he has as a contender. He's going around his estate on Long Island at Locust Valley, okay, which is a very ritzy area. And he's going around the garden in his golf puttees. Presidents golfing tend to really tick people off, okay? Whether it's today or they found out in 1920, Will Hayes warned Warren Harding. This is the one thing which is setting people off in the newsreels. When they see you golfing, it just upsets people. So Davis is pictured in this gleaming white golf suit, swinging a golf course around his manicured gardens. The other person that they photograph in sound, and you can watch this on YouTube, and I just saw it the other day, is the Progressive Party candidate. The Progressives were going to bolt. They had nominated Robert La Follette, senator from Wisconsin, before the Democrats met. And they were sort of a leftover bag, leftover from TR's 1912 election, with the prairie populists of something called the Farmer Labor Party, the Nonpartisan League of North Dakota, a Committee of 48, again, TR-type progressives left over, Fiorello LaGuardia from New York. The communists tried to get in. La Follette pushed them away. And the socialists. The Socialist Party was fading fast. They had drawn almost 1 million votes in 1920, but aside from being prosecuted by the government during the war, but the split from the communists really hurt them a lot. So they're all backing La Follette. La Follette was fighting Bob. He had wanted the nomination for president in 1912, but TR gets in his way. Another thing getting in his way was a lot of these progressives like Hiram Johnson or Norris or William Borah were kind of angry guys. And in 1912 in Philadelphia, La Follette is giving his speech pretty much to announce his candidacy and has a nervous breakdown right on stage. Doesn't help his campaign, but they love him in Wisconsin. They love him in Wisconsin. And he appears to be in this film a very old-fashioned sort of speaker, even though his program looks very modern by today's standards. He looks like somebody who had first been elected to office in 1891. Coolidge also gives his speech, and it is, you can still see this on YouTube, and it really boils down what his philosophy is, which is very simple, and I'll read some of it to you. I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and for themselves, which is what Richard Norton Smith had referenced. Until we can reestablish a condition under which the earnings of the people can be kept by the people, we are bound to suffer a very severe and distinct curtailment of our liberty. These results are not fanciful, they are not imaginary. They are grimly actual and real, reaching into every household and land. They take from each home annually an average of over $300. And taxes must be paid. They are not a voluntary contribution to be met out of surplus earnings. They are a stern necessity. They come first. It is only out of what is left after they are paid that the necessities of food, clothing, and shelter can be provided, and the comforts of home secured, or the yearnings of the soul for a broader and more abundant life gratified. When the government effects a new economy, it grants everybody a life pension with which to raise the standard of existence. It increases the value of everybody's prosperity, raises the scale of everybody's wages. One of the greatest favors that can be bestowed upon the American people is economy in government. Or, as he said on another point, I am for economy. After that, I am for more economy. And he meant it. Now, today, the national debt as a percentage of GDP under Bush, under Obama, is less than it was under Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman because of World War II. The same thing occurred in World War I, where the national debt went up, where the income tax went up to 70%. Coolidge eventually takes it down to 50%, or to 25%, the highest marginal tax rate. Harding had taken it down to 50%. Coolidge's campaign succeeds, not on the strength of his personality, but on the strength, well, in a way it does, in the strength of that the economy is booming, that there had been a depression in 1920 and 1921. There's a new book coming out by James Grant, which will detail how that was dealt with, which was basically to let it correct itself. And then there is how Coolidge deals with the Harding scandals, which is, again, a laissez-faire attitude, and the laissez-faire being, let the chips fall where they may. He orders Daugherty, Harding's very suspect attorney general, out of the cabinet, and he appoints 2 prosecutors to deal with the oil scandals. The American people realize that he's stepping aside, he's letting things take their course, letting justice take their course, and even though the Democrats did their best to tie the scandals into the Republican Party, they did not touch Coolidge at all. So the campaign goes on like that. One of the big issues is, again, that Ku Klux Klan. Davis gives a number of anti-Klan speeches. Coolidge does not, but he's of course Silent Cal, so he's very careful about what he says. But if you watch what he does and where he goes, one of the great images of the 1920s, I guess, is 40,000 Klansmen marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in their sheets and their hoods. They had wanted Coolidge to attend. He was out of town. They had also, not being the most together operation, actually forgot to invite him. But he wasn't going anyway. Where he did go was to a Holy Name Society gathering. Remember, the Klan was anti-black, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish. 150,000 Roman Catholics gather in the shadow of the Washington Monument, and Coolidge addresses them. And what's even more remarkable is this was not the largest public gathering, religious gathering of the 20s in America. Half a million Catholics gathered in Chicago for a Eucharistic Congress in the 1920s. Coolidge addresses them, gives a very supportive speech. He also attends a dedication for the Jewish Community Center in Washington. He goes to the commencement at Howard University, the historic black school in Washington, D.C. And he does something else. In, I think, August of 1924, a fellow from Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn, writes to him. And it's about supporting a candidate for Congress. And the fellow is very much opposed to it. And Coolidge does something very unusual. He makes his response to this citizen, ordinary citizen, public. And the letter is that this fellow, a fellow named Gardner, Charles Gardner, said, the Republican Party is nominating a black for Congress in Harlem. What are you going to do about it? This is an outrage. This has never happened before when the Republican Party, or anyone actually, had nominated a black in the North. And Coolidge is absolutely outraged. And he writes, "My dear sir, your letter is received, accompanied by a newspaper clipping which discussed the possibility that a colored man may be the Republican nominee from one of the New York districts. Referring to this newspaper statement, you say, it is some concern whether a Negro is allowed to run for Congress anywhere, at any time, in any party, in this, a white man's country. Repeated ignoring of the growing race problem does not excuse us for allowing encroachments. Leaving out consideration of the manifest impropriety of the president intruding himself in a local contest for nomination." Oops. Well, anyway, the second page appears to be missing. He really ripped this guy a new one and made it public. It is a remarkable document, particularly in the face of the Klan, which is consistent also with Coolidge's normal philosophy of courting the black vote. He has people come in, he has blacks come into the White House to be photographed with him, something which Hoover is going to avoid. He had supported banning the showing of Birth of a Nation in Boston back when that was first shown in the 19-teens. And he's always supportive of their war efforts, either in terms of supporting the draft in World War I or the immense sacrifices they made in supporting the bond issues. So all that leads to a remarkable victory for Calvin Coolidge and the Republicans in November 1924. The Americans love box scores, so I'm going to give you the box score. Electoral vote, Coolidge and his running mate Charles Gates Dawes, 382. Davis, 136. La Follette, he carries that state of Wisconsin, 13 votes. So it's 35 votes to 12 to 1. 15 million, almost 16 million votes for Coolidge, 8.3 for Davis, and 4.8 for La Follette. Harding had carried 60% roughly 4 years before. Coolidge's percentage goes down to 54% on the nose. A landslide is designated technically as 55%. So is this a landslide or not? Yeah, it is, because it's a three-way race. Remember how Bill Clinton never receives a majority in a three-way race, that Woodrow Wilson never receives a majority in a three-way race, that Harry Truman does not. Yet Coolidge, 54%. In the West, in many states, I think in 11 or 12 states, La Follette beats Davis. The Democrat finishes third in like a dozen states. The Democrat receives 28.8% of the vote. This is the lowest percent a Democrat or a major party candidate has received since the beginning of the party system. It's been said that this is the destruction or the end of the old Democratic Party. And I think that's true, because the older populists like Bryan and McAdoo are kind of swept away. And even though Smith doesn't do particularly well in the conventions, the more urban-based Democratic Party of Al Smith is going to come to the fore. You also see, and it's very important, the La Follette candidacy. He gets 16.6%. It's not bad. It doesn't translate into much in the Electoral College. It's particularly disappointed to them because they were following that sort of traditional third party, not protest strategy, but troublemaker strategy. And I don't mean by raising issues that other parties won't, but that Electoral College thing, where George Wallace or Henry Wallace, not Henry Wallace, but Strom Thurmond said, we're going to throw this election into the House of Representatives. So their strategy was to somehow throw the race into the House of Representatives and then somehow or other convince enough members of the House to vote for whoever. Work a deal. Doesn't work out. Actually, the reverse happens, because the Republicans are able to train their fire not on the conservative Davis, but on the radical La Follette, and say, A, he's radical, and B, if you vote for him, or if you waste your vote on Davis, you're going to have chaos. So the slogan becomes not only keep cool with Coolidge, but Coolidge or chaos. And the result is that huge Coolidge victory. Now, does it translate into something which is, the irony is he has the big victory, but does the conservative majority, which you could say, well, the conservatives got, what, 76% of the vote in that race? Something like that, 3/4 of the vote. Does it translate into something which is continuing? Or does the La Follette situation of all these left-wing groups come together and the splitting off, and then they are able to join with Franklin Roosevelt in 1932? So you move from a solid Republican and or conservative majority into something very different as conditions change. But in the interim, Coolidge delivers a second term which has been called the only successful second term in history, because he gets his tax cuts through, he gets his peace treaties through, he has economy and government, he reduces the national debt, he reduces those marginal tax rates, unemployment averages like about 3%, inflation is 1.6%. So by the standards of what he is trying to do, what he cares about, he has an immensely successful presidency. And that is why on November 4th, 1924, there was great jubilation in the White House and with Calvin Coolidge. And thank you all for listening. Now, I'll take any questions if you have them. And I will repeat the question. Yes. Not technically, because a landslide is 55%, but that's in a two. The question is it not a landslide? But you going further with that?
I was just going to say, you beat him 2-1.
Right. It's an immense popular margin. So, but technically, you say it's 54%, and it's not that big. But in a three-way race, and remember that La Follette was technically a Republican. His running mate, a guy named Burton K. Wheeler, who's a senator from Montana, is a Democrat. So this is a bipartisan, progressive uprising. And an interesting point about La Follette and Wheeler is it also shows that the progressive political tradition at that point, or movement, it can often be isolationist. Robert La Follette is the big isolationist guy in World War I. He's almost run out of Congress. And Burton K. Wheeler survives. Burton K. Wheeler, who is the first big congressional Democrat to support Franklin Roosevelt in '32, by 1940 is a serious isolationist and has to be purged from the Democratic Party at that point. But yeah, I mean, this is a super blowout, even though it technically doesn't meet that 55 threshold, but it's in a three-way. It's the equivalent, I was thinking coming over here, is this the equivalent of a 4 or 5 game World Series victory? And it's the margins against Davis are so big, it's the equivalent of a 3-game World Series victory. Anyone else? Yes, in the back. The question is, Republicans now, conservative, Democrats, liberal. What happened? Why the switch? And a lot of things happen. The parties used to be more of coalitions, unlikely coalitions, particularly the Democratic Party, which was, I think, described once as a coalition of people, you know, brought together by common prejudices or something. And so you would have the northern Catholics, urban people, workers, tied up with more conservative Southerners, although the conservativeness of the Southern Democratic Party can be overstated. Where back then, you know, there was a guy named Huey Long. He was not conservative, okay? He was more to the left economically than Franklin Roosevelt. And there was a populist tradition down there. And often, like Cotton, Ed Smith or Tom Heflin, that the more radical populist people were actually the most racist people of the progressive era. So these things can be jumbled up. And you've got a Republican Party which contains both William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. And in 1924, you have a Republican Party that contains Coolidge on the right, and then it also contains these people like Hiram Johnson, Borah, Senator Borah, who was a progressive of Idaho. Coolidge wanted Borah to be his running mate, or to be on the ticket. And Borah responded, which end? He was an ornery guy. In fact, someone said they had seen Borah riding through Rock Creek Park in Washington, and Borah had this reputation for being so difficult. And so they tell Coolidge they had seen Borah riding this horse through the park, and Coolidge says, was he going in the same direction as the horse? So everyone realistically kind of knew where they were different. So the parties were not quite as defined, but they do become more and more defined, even with Hoover and Coolidge in 1924, where Hoover is more a progressive, and they do not get along either personally or on policies. At the end of his term, Coolidge says of Hoover, and Coolidge is very circumspect. He just doesn't say bad things about people. But he says about Hoover, he calls Hoover Wonder Boy. And he says, that man has given me nothing but bad advice for 6 years. He is not like Herbert Hoover. But how it all happens is, I think that the Franklin Roosevelt experiment, or the 4 terms of that, goes a long way. Franklin Roosevelt spoke of realigning the parties in 1940. That if he stayed in power long enough, he would force the conservatives out. And that may have been one of the things he was trying to do by putting Henry Wallace in as vice president for his 3rd term, replacing John Nance Garner, who was more of a conservative. But it's all by steps. You take a look, even when I started following these things, not only the people like John McClellan or Sam Ervin in the Democratic Party, but also in the Republican Party, it was not unusual to have a Tom Kuechel or a Jacob Javits or a Nelson Rockefeller. How it just kind of all shook out, probably got neater, but it has made the maneuvering, I think, a little harder. But there was no one great thing. It was just evolution, as Darwin would say. Anyone else? Well, I move we adjourn. Oh, no. The question is, do we see a chance for such a lopsided result in a presidential election? Yeah, because things change so wildly. Where you know, like those 1920, 1922, 1924 elections, which flip so much. Or I was talking to a lady back there before we started, and talking about Prohibition, and how Prohibition was not an issue in the 1924 election, because it had been settled. It was in the Constitution. 1920, not really an issue. It had been settled. 1928 delivers the driest, most pro-prohibition Congress in American history, 1928. By 1932, Prohibition is done. So things switch very, very wildly. And, you know, we move from Lyndon Johnson blowing out Goldwater in '64 to Richard Nixon in '68, but more so to the Republicans having a big midterm in '68. It's people want to know if trends always augur to what they're going to be, and they may point to things, but they often don't. But I think the best answer is one I would always give when I was asked, when I was a baseball historian, who was like going to win the World Series, and I'd say, I'm a historian, not a prophet. No, it ain't over. Okay, anyone else? I move we adjourn to the cookies.